back to the Soccer Queens podcast, where we discuss everything female athlete performance training. Today, I have Mike Boyle back on the show. It's been a few years since he's been on, but we are super excited to have him discuss in-season training. So, Mike, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back. I love to do these. I could sit and talk all day. That's why I said it's an easy thing to do.
Well, I appreciate your time and coming back on, but why don't you remind everyone what you're up to today and who you're working with?
So we work with a really broad range of athletes. The good thing for us, we work with lots of female athletes. We don't have a ton, obviously, this year. It's soccer season has started, so we don't have as many in-season soccer players as we might like to, but we've got female ice hockey players. We've got a couple of U.S. Olympians. We've got a couple of the best women's lacrosse players actually in the world, some people that are on the world team. We've got a bunch of women's professional hockey players. And then we have our standard, we've got a pretty big kind of mom and dad program too. So we really run the gamut.
Awesome. So let's just jump right into in-season training. So it is that time of year when club season is starting to pick up for soccer players, but also the high school soccer season. So how do you navigate this time of year when clients are worried, well, is in-season training going to be too much? Can we take these 3 to 4 months off and then come back? What are your thoughts on in-season training?
Well, in a perfect world, I would love to have our athletes with us 2 days a week, year round. That's the perfect world. Unfortunately, in the world that we live in with high school sports, with club sports, with kids having multiple commitments, we lose them a lot during the in-season period. And we're really trying to get them to understand. I think you've probably seen some of my Instagram and Twitter stuff, where one of the things I always tell everybody is the best way to get stronger is not to get weaker. So if you can get into the weight room 2 days a week and do a really minimalist kind of program, you can maintain that place that you left maybe our summer program at, and then be ready when the soccer season is over. And again, for us, it depends. Like, you're in Florida, I don't know, because it varies. Soccer for us is fall. I know on the West Coast it's winter, and then some places it's year round because of club. But for us, the high school season is the fall season. The winter is more or less an off-season training time for us, where people will struggle really to get field space and to be able to do the things that they need to do. And then club will crank up kind of in the spring and in the summer. But for us, if we could keep people 2 days a week year round, that would be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Now, for the parents who are concerned that in-season strength is going to be too much, what do you usually say to them as far as how the program is structured to just work around that issue and concern?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to just get them comfortable with the fact that, hey, we know what we're doing. It's not going to be too much. We're not. And I think anybody who's trained with us realizes we always talk about things like minimal effective dose anyway, in terms of we're not a big multi-set program. We're not a program. We have some people who are disappointed even in our off-season program that their kids don't leave with kind of, their tongues hanging on the ground, and that they can still walk when they leave, and that they're not soaked in sweat. And somebody made a really good analogy yesterday. I was listening. It's a guy named Lachlan Wilmot, who I think is maybe an Australian rules football guy, but he said, it's like keeping your toaster on 3 all the time. You never burn the toast. And I thought that was a really good analogy. So when we're looking at our kids, it's sort of like we always want to have it on 3, and he was saying, put it on 3 and then always pop it up early and check on it. And I think that's the kind of stuff that you have to talk to parents about, that, hey, we understand what we're doing. We're not trying to kill anybody. What we're hopefully going to be able to do, particularly during that in-season period, is just not go backwards. Because what most kids are like a yo-yo in terms of they spend a lot of time in the off season and they make progress, and then boom, the in-season comes, they do nothing, it goes down again, they come back to you. So you've got a kid who's maybe inching their way up slowly in terms of kind of speed and power and the things that we're looking for. But the lack of consistency is what really stops them from doing it. One of what I do now is I train a lot of my son's friends who are multi-sport kids, lacrosse players, hockey players. And it's the kids that are consistently get there that make the most progress. There is nothing else. If you looked and said, okay, who's having the most success, it would equate 100% to attendance. The people that are there the most have the most success. It's not if everybody came, it would be the most genetically gifted people that had the most success. But that's the other thing I try to sell parents on, is that this is your time for your kid to work their way by people. This is the time for your kid to really take advantage of the fact that maybe they're willing to do a little bit more than everybody else is willing to do, and get themselves in the weight room. And it doubly applies to the young female, because that's, I mean, this is it's a really, I say impressionable, and I mean it in the sense that strength training can make a massive impression on these kids. The change that you can make in a young female body in a 6-month period of time is immense.
Mhm.
And I always say I'm an analogist, but it's kind of like reeling in a fish. Once you get the hook in, you got to reel them in, and that's the key with young athletes. Is you've got to reel them in. You got to keep them on the line. You've got to keep them going. And honestly, we don't succeed all the time. I think that's what some people live in an Instagram world where they think everything is perfect, and the reality for us is we may lose a lot of our girls for 10 weeks, and we may not see them till after Thanksgiving. And when they come back, we will do the best that we can. But even the kids who are even consistent 2 or 3 off seasons out of the year are also the ones that make the most progress. Like if you came to our facility, I'd be able to look at you and say, hey, go tell me who's been here before. And you'd be like, oh, she has, and she has. And these 4 over here have never been here before. It's so obvious that any coach that walked in would see the difference, because the initial part of training, whether it's in season, off season, whatever it is kind of weight room competency. Can you get kids that are competent in the weight room, that can do the basic things that you need them to do? So
Mhm. Now, with your athletes who have continued year round, they don't drop off in season. You said that they've had greater success as far as their performance, but have you also seen they're not feeling as sore, they're not suffering as many injuries as well?
yes, without a doubt. I mean, our kids in general, it's really, and unfortunately, I always said out my biggest failure. My son tore his ACL in lacrosse in November, so it's almost coming up on a year. And so you can't protect everybody, and my son is probably as consistent or more consistent than anybody. People are going to get hurt, but yes, if you just said statistically looking at it, no question, we don't see. And because we sprint consistently, because we jump consistently, we don't see the little hamstring pulls and groin pulls and a lot of things that the year-round kid, because there's our kids are multi-sport, and the ones who tend to get hurt are what I would call multi-team, where they're playing the same sport but on 2 or 3 different teams at the same time. Those are the ones who tend to have problems. Tend to have hip issues and hamstring issues and overuse stuff. And again, because you're like you said, this is audience and younger. I always tell everybody, kids should not have adult problems. You shouldn't have kids with tendonitis. You shouldn't have kids with achy hips and sore backs. Those to me are massive red flags that something is very drastically wrong with what you're doing, and it's time to back off. And that's the other thing I think people have to look at and realize, that if you've got a kid who's in sort of the 11 to 15 age group and is playing club, it's kind of like, okay, you don't have to worry day to day. You should be worrying year to year, because whatever pot of gold you think might be at the end of the rainbow in terms of a college scholarship or whatever it is that you're dreaming about is still a long way away. And the best way to get it is with that consistency. It's the biggest thing. If you read Slight Edge.
I have.
Yeah. So I always talk about Slight Edge in terms of Jeff Olson talks about. I mean, it's really simple, right? He says showing up is Slight Edge principle number 1. Showing up consistently is Slight Edge principle number 2. And showing up consistently with a great attitude is Slight Edge principle number 3. But you got to get them to show up, and you've got to get them to show up consistently.
Are you finding that some of these kids they're opting to be on 2 school teams, or their club team and their school team, and the first thing to get out of their schedule is strength training?
Absolutely. We were just talking about that the other day on our strengthcoach.com site, and Scott Hansen, who's out in San Diego, was saying that it's always the first thing to go, oh, I can't make lifting.
Yeah.
And that's the easy way out. And the problem, and I think you and I know exactly what what I'm talking about, but we're talking to people that don't get involved in the same conversations probably on Twitter. But it is that, like, parents are really well intentioned. None of them are trying to screw up their kid. None of them are trying to do what's wrong. They just don't understand the process of making a child better at something. They think adults are under the mistaken impression that the way you get your child better at something is to have your child focus. And that's just not true. It's actually, you want your kid, the evidence is so overwhelming that making your kid a really good generalist, it's sort of like you want your kid to be a really great soccer player, then probably get them out of soccer at some point during the course of the year. Get them in the weight room. Again, if you've got younger kids, get them into tumbling, get them into gymnastics. My daughter just left yesterday to go and play professional hockey. She's going to Buffalo. She signed with one of the women's professional teams. And she was a great little soccer player when she was a kid. And she would get tripped and she would simply do forward rolls and get right back up and run. And people would be like, she got tripped and knocked down and then she just rolled and got back up. I'm like, yeah, that's because we took her to gymnastics when she was little and she understands how her body works. And she thinks nothing of, rolling herself up into a ball. And she'd come off the field doing cartwheels, and she's a shorter, stockier, sturdier looking kid who you wouldn't expect to be able to roll around and do cartwheels. But that was gymnastics background. And so I think getting them, making the base broader in the beginning, whether that be, weight room or whether that be other sports, is really important for these people. And yet we think, like for you or I, if we said, hey, I want to be great at something, then we got to really dial in and say, okay, I want to be a great strength and conditioning coach. And I got to focus. I got to go 100% all in. I'm not going to get better by going out and saying, I'm going to read a couple of law books. But for a kid, it's the polar opposite. Your kid will be much more athletic if you expose them to a broader range of athletic skills.
Let's get into the early specialization discussion because this is still a huge debate. And I'm seeing it's not really getting better, even though there's a lot of people speaking out. And I've had several people ignore advice, but then 5 years down the road, they come back and they say, you were right. My daughter has tendonitis or hip issues or stress fractures. And at this point, it's like, I don't even want to be like, I told you so. I just hate seeing people go through it the hard way, but they still don't listen. And I don't know how we solve this.
I don't either. I've said repeatedly that I think the system is very broken and maybe not fixable because there's so much money in early specialization that there are coaches who lie, because you can't study early specialization and not come up with a massive amount of evidence that tells you that it's a bad idea. But you're still, if you're maybe the club soccer coach or you're the club basketball coach or the club volleyball coach, your income is based on having those kids around on a year-round period. I think one way to solve it would be if you could get some of these youth clubs to be literally multi-sport clubs, maybe just two, where you might say, okay, we're going to have a volleyball club and a soccer club, and in the winter we're going to be a volleyball club, and in the fall and spring we're going to be a soccer club. Something along that line, so that somebody could make a living, which is what they're trying to do, but you'd be able to get these kids out of sports. What they're doing, some of the Premier League academies are making their kids play other sports during the time that they're young. That's their solution, which is a really good one, because I always say, if you think we have it screwed up, talk to somebody in the UK
Mhm.
where they're competing with academy contracts for 9-year-old kids, and they've got rules like you can't sign with a team that's, I don't know, more than 15 or 20 miles from your house or something like that. But they're literally trying to sign kids to their academy programs at 9 years old. It makes us look almost sane. I went over there to do a talk one time and I said, geez, you guys really have screwed it up worse than we have. I didn't think anybody could do that, but you guys have. And most of the guys over there are like, yeah, you're right. It's a mess. Absolute. And the parents are nuts. Our problem is a parent education problem in the early specialization area. And I think that's why we're not making inroads in a lot of ways, because we're not looking at the right place for the solution. The right place for the solution is in parent education.
Mhm.
But the right place for the solution is also people in the club system being honest and people in the club system saying, we know this isn't good.
Mhm.
And what they do instead, and I've been saying this for years, but everybody likes to point out the outlier. Everybody likes to point out Venus and Serena Williams, and everybody likes to point out Tiger Woods or these people and say, hey, these kids started, Tiger had a club in his hand, when he was 3 years old or something, walking around the golf course. And I'm kind of like, I tell people, if his dad had been a football coach, he probably would have been a really good linebacker at whatever school his father coached at. He's a genetic outlier. The Williams sisters would have been great soccer players. They would have been great basketball players. They would have been great at anything that they chose to pursue. And so they're not, you need to look statistically at the bigger body of evidence and say, are there lots of people that are going down this path and coming out the right way at the end? And then you realize that actually, it's funny. I haven't watched King Richard yet, but people said he was very open about the fact that they weren't typical club tennis kids, and they weren't kids that were playing one sport, and they were kids that he was very willing to let them have time off to do the things that they wanted to do. So I just think as adults, we get a lot of confirmation bias through the media, and it makes us think that we're right. And we don't listen to people like you said, like you or like me. I look at people and say, hey, I've actually done this. My daughter now is a professional hockey player. She's one of, I don't know if there's 7 teams and 20 girls in the team. So there's 140. There might be 300 girls in the US playing hockey at a professional level. And she's one of those 300. And I kept her out of summer hockey till she was 13, did not allow her to play in a summer hockey game. And people told me, oh my God, she's going to fall behind. You're killing her possibility of getting a scholarship. And I was like, I don't think so. I think I'm doing the right thing. And I think at some point like this, where we're talking now, I'm going to be able to look back at people and say, nope, I thought I was right when she was doing gymnastics. I thought I was right when she was doing judo. I thought I was right when she was on swim team. I thought I was right in all of those situations. And now I look at it and think I was right.
It's just so crazy to just look at so many experiences, case studies in the literature, and it points to, hey, kids should sample and they shouldn't be chasing after a single sport year round since elementary school. And one thing I hear parents say is, well, everything's great now. She loves playing. We're not going to give her off in the summer. She just wants to play on her 3v3 team or whatever it is and do all these summer tournaments. And everything seems good now at that age, but then eventually in high school, that's when the injuries begin to manifest. Even though in 5th grade, it's like, oh, they're all fine now. So, what do you say to those parents who are like, well, she just loves it?
Well, I have the standard answers. The good thing for me is I've been developing these standard answers for years. I look at parents because they always say, "Well, this is what she loves to do," and I said, "Well, what if she came to you and said she loved smoking marijuana? Would you just look at me and say, well, she loves it. She loves the way that it makes her feel. She loves how she is with her friends with that, and I'm just going to let her do it." You wouldn't do that. Or
Right.
she loves not going to school. She likes to stay home. She'd much rather sleep. You know what I mean? Like they just somehow sports becomes one of these conversations where they love it is enough of an excuse to justify the wrong. And it really is a wrong. But I said, if you give them the extreme analogy in some other situation and then say, well, what if they told you that they really liked it and that this was their favorite part of the day? Does it matter what it would be? Or just because it's a sport and because it allows you the ability to kind of justify it? I mean, my daughter, a lot of times I made her do stuff. There were the times when it was like, no, you're gonna play soccer. And she was always like, Dad, I don't really love soccer. I don't love the soccer girls. I don't love the whole soccer thing. I'm like, I get it. But you're gonna play soccer in the fall and you're gonna play soccer in the spring and you're gonna get outside and you're gonna run and you're gonna kick a ball. Because I know that down the road that's gonna be good for you. And as I said, I look at it now and think it was good for her. In the same way, I remember people saying she picks up bad passes in her skates really well. And I'm like, yeah, that's because she plays soccer. She's very comfortable with things being in her feet from her time playing soccer. And people would be like, well, she's not afraid of contact. She doesn't mind getting run into. I'm like, well, that's because in judo you fight other kids. You go out on a mat and you fight another. She was fighting boys when she was 8 and 9 years old and beating boys at judo. And I mean, these are all experiences. I always look at and think, if you really said, hey, my goal is I want my kid to be a great college athlete, then I would say then the key is sampling. The key, you're going about it completely wrong.
Mhm.
And that's the part I think that the parents don't get. I think they look at it and feel like, hey, I'm trying to do the best thing here, because even if they said this is what my kid really wanted, my kid wanted to be an Olympic ice hockey player. She's not at that level. She's not in the top 80, let's say, but she's still good enough to play professionally. And to help her to achieve her dream, I had to sometimes push her in directions that she didn't necessarily want to go.
I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here, but with like the parents who choose early specialization for their kid, sometimes they'll be like, well, at least we're strength training, that can count as a second sport and give them a chance against injuries. What would you say to something like that? I mean, obviously strength training is important, but does that make up for the second sport and just sampling other things, or is that not
That's
enough?
an interesting thing. I would almost, if someone said that to me and that was their rationale, I would be like, okay, that's a pretty intelligent rationale.
Mhm.
I would still say when, because the one thing you want to be, when's the off season? If we're talking about soccer, when is she not going to play soccer? That's what I want to know. And if you said, hey, okay, summer, because again, I love people say, well, summer, we go to our house wherever it is, we go to Maine or we go to New Hampshire and the kids water ski and tube. It's sort of like, okay, at some point there still has to be an off season, because otherwise you are going to get into those overuse situations. All of a sudden you're going to have, like you said, whether it's, hip injuries or stress fractures, or this stuff is going to mount, because again, the evidence is very, very clear that the early specialist, one, not only doesn't achieve what the late specialist achieves, but gets injured at a much higher rate. And that's the part. And who knows? I mean, I guess it's just a matter of us continuing to maybe shout into the wilderness like we're doing right now, and hope that over time more and more people will hear. The problem now, and I've said this before too, is that we're competing there. There are hedge funds now that are buying into youth sports teams. So when you realize you're competing in a billion-dollar business, a multi-billion-dollar business, against people whose sole objective is to make money from these businesses, that's when it gets really difficult. And that's why I think we've more than got our work cut out for us.
Mhm. It's so hard, and it's like, I don't know what the solution is, except, like, as you said, just to keep shouting and going on Twitter, and like you said, parent education is huge, but also coaches need to be honest with people and give these kids an off season. And yeah, there's really no answer to it, but we just keep trying our best. Another thing I've been seeing a lot of recently is the rise of GPS technology in the youth soccer space and load monitoring to kind of just handle this issue of year-round sport. What are your thoughts on load monitoring?
I think honestly, at that age level, it's probably kind of silly. I can't believe, I was just looking, somebody just sent me the pricing information on one of these GPS systems, and it's not cheap.
Mhm.
And I don't know. I think it's a lot easier to just say, hey, let's just do something else for a couple of months than it is to say, oh, let's invest thousands of dollars in our 9-year-old team having GPS units that they're going to put on and and run around, and somebody's going to be there monitoring. Because and there's still a lot of that's an area that's in its infancy anyway. I've been looking into it relative to lacrosse, just because some of the claims that people make about, you get into the claims of, oh, the kids ran 3 miles today. That's what the GPS unit showed. And I'm like, no, no, no. The GPS unit did not show that. The GPS unit showed that they covered 3 miles today. They didn't run it. And then you start looking at how did they cover it, how fast. And one of my gripes with it, I think a lot of the GPS units use something like 12 meters a second as a high-speed running ceiling. Now, 12 meters a second as a high-speed running ceiling might be really, really high in youth soccer and probably way too low in women's college soccer. And so you start looking at that and thinking, okay, how are they even evaluating what bands are these kids in, and what really constitutes high speed running, and what's actually happening out on the field. And I just look at that and think that's sort of it's typical parents, right? Let's apply a really high tech solution to a relatively low tech problem by GPSing all our kids. I do think you're in the Premier League. Hey, load monitoring, I think, is a really good idea. I think you need to know how far everybody's running and how fast everybody's running, and you need to know as best you can what's going on in practice. If you've got a U12 team in Florida, I think that's pretty irrelevant. But I had somebody the other day send me some U14 football data, and I just sent a polite, hey, thanks. That was great. But I wanted to be like, I can't believe you have U14 American football data on these kids with GPS units.
Yeah, it's interesting. People are jumping to doing the technology first and spending their club budget on that rather than having these kids do a strength training program and just start with the basics first, because it's like what good is that unit if they're not even prepared to handle those demands? Like what are we even doing with the data? And I've seen so many soccer clubs get GPS units without doing a performance program, and the coaches aren't even looking at the data. I've asked a handful of club coaches for like U15 girls teams. I'm like, hey, what are you doing with this data? And are you looking what's going on with the amount of running they're doing and the actions they're doing? And everyone's like clueless. And I'm like, what's the point to this if no one's even taking the data and taking action on it?
Well, and most of the people aren't qualified to analyze the data. I know, and again, I consider myself to be reasonably intelligent, and I'm just looking at the data and thinking, as again, like I said, particularly like the high speed running data. Okay, what are they actually calling high speed running? And what we're seeing, what you might see with kids. Sorry, I'm going to squirm around a little bit here. With kids, it might show too much high speed running because, again, you start looking and saying, well, I was writing down some stuff the other day. What's the maximum miles per hour for a 14-year-old girl? And I'll guarantee no one could, or the average person can't tell you that. I was looking at it today. Our faster kids are like 18, 19, 20 miles an hour, high school boys going into in their senior year. So I'm looking and thinking the females might be, 15, 16, 17 miles an hour as top speed. So then you start looking and saying, well, what am I going to define high speed running as? Am I going to drop that down to above 10, and then you've got to convert miles per hour to meters per second. And there's a lot of math and there's a lot going on there that is probably well over the head of the average U15 girl club soccer coach.
Mm-hmm.
But people love tech.
I know, and that seems to be the first thing they jump to because it looks cool. But do you think the private sector performance coach could use this data kind of as ammunition to show the parents, hey, here's how much your daughter is actually doing, and here's how we solve this with strength training and preparing her for that load? Could we use it as ammunition against parents, coaches?
If you were really good at crunching the data, yes. Because the one thing, I love the old expression, figures lie and liars figure. And I think you could use the data to tell almost any story that you wanted to if you were good at analyzing the data, because you could say, hey, there's a huge amount of running that's going on here. And we need, we always talk, and I say that anyway. I always tell people, I'm not worried about, because we going to get into, well, I'll take a step back. In the conditioning thing, when people are having these girls jog and run miles and do all that stuff, I'm like, hey, that bucket is full. And the GPS data would show you that bucket is relatively full. But the bucket that's empty is the high speed running bucket. And the bucket, so I look at it and think high speed running, strength, power. These are things that the kids are getting maybe zero exposure to. And then they're getting hurt, particularly. And again, we could go on forever, but particularly with your female athlete going through puberty is in a terrible disadvantage because, and I've watched this with my own kids, boys gain propulsive muscle mass as they go through puberty. Females tend to gain non-propulsive mass. They get, breasts get bigger, hips get wider. Like the things that are going on when a female is maturing are in probably direct opposition to making you better at sports. And then you've got a kid who really may be struggling. We see some of our girls, they get slower as they go through puberty because their body changes. And that's really frustrating when they look and they think, wait a second, I'm doing all this training, I'm getting slower. And you kind of want to look at them and think, well, yeah, you're not like, you can't, because the conversations are often inappropriate or indelicate. You can't look at someone and say, well, have you looked at yourself from last year to this year? Like you don't look the same. And the things that don't look the same about you are not things that are going to make you a better sprinter. And then you think that's what's contributing to the ACL problem, because now you've got a girl who isn't gaining strength, but who is gaining mass. And now deceleration becomes a problem, and most of those injuries are going to happen in, decelerative situations. You suddenly got somebody basically, hey, we've made the truck way bigger, but we didn't change the brakes. And then that's why you see, I think, that the ACL thing is very much a puberty thing. You don't generally see ACL tears with these younger kids. And it's because they're prepubescent and they probably haven't gotten to that point where the sort of the chassis outstrips the brakes kind of thing, and they're going to get hurt. So for me, that would always be my biggest sales tool. If I was really trying to reel in a lot of young females, I think, and I always say that it's how you package it. I'd be packaging it as ACL injury prevention all the time, because I think that's the type of stuff that grabs a parent much more so than, if I said, oh, I can get Erica, to go from 15 miles an hour to 16 miles an hour sprinting. Someone might be, that's great, you get a little faster. But if I could say that statistically, we think we can lower her probability of having an ACL tear by 10% or 20% or 30%, whatever the data might show. And the ACL data is great because any intervention works. No matter what people did, the incidence of ACLs went down. So it's really easy to find that kind of data.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about the importance of getting girls to be exposed to those higher velocity actions, because they're not getting enough of that within their practices. And sometimes I've even heard that the practices just aren't intense enough, that they're not getting the conditioning effect to keep that level of conditioning for the game. And then they ask for extra conditioning, and I just get confused because I'm like, well, isn't that the coach's job to condition at practice? But is there a way to get athletes more conditioned in season, or like whose job is that?
Well, I think it's the coach's job, but they're not going to do it. So I do think yes. And one of the things that I think at some points in time, maybe you just need to give somebody a little bit of a smile and a yes, and then have them do a little bit of tempo running at the end of the workout and think, okay, we went after that conditioning bucket with some moderate intensity stuff. We didn't kill them. They're not dripping with sweat. We might have said, okay, we're going to do, depending on what size surface you have, 8 tempo runs, 6 tempo runs, where we're going to run up, jog back. And so the parent feels heard, and you look at it and think, yeah, we did something that will maybe help, but definitely won't hurt. So I would not have a problem with that as much, particularly if I knew also that I could get some sprint work in early in the workout. We're very, like, for us, we time sprint pretty much every time someone is in the gym now, they're going to do some sort of time sprinting, because I feel like that's the thing that kids don't really miss, or don't really miss, that they do really miss, is that 100% speed exposure. And I think I always say, when you watch like the Premier League games and you see the number of guys that pull hamstrings, I think it directly relates to the fact that the only time they get full speed exposure is when somebody lobs a ball over their head, and now they've got to turn around and win the race to the ball. And now that person is trying to access 100 or 101% of their maximum speed, and they haven't done that in a really long time, and all of a sudden they're hopping off the field. So we try to make sure we get that max speed exposure. But that is where the GPS data would be valuable, because you might be able to look and think again, if I look at the game data and I say, wait a second, Erica hit 100% 3 times during the course of the game, I may not have her sprint, because I may have realized that you might have been that striker who got, long balls hit past her and had to really motor to get to that ball. Whereas I might look at everybody else and think, but everyone else needs to do a couple sprints today. And that's where, particularly as it applies to soccer, I would be very unequal if I could calculate it. One of the things that we used to do when we first started, we had worked with the Boston Breakers when they very first started their team, probably, I'm going to say early 2000s. First year they had the National Women's Soccer League. And we were big on conditioning post game, and we'd condition all of our non-starters and non-players right after the game was over. Yeah. And our feeling was, what we want to basically do is level up everybody that didn't play in some way close to those people that did. So in a perfect world, that's where it gets done. And in an imperfect world, you might need to be the person that does that. If you have someone who says, hey, I'm playing limited minutes, or maybe I'm playing in the back and I'm not, our coach likes us to just kind of hang back and kick the ball to the other end of the field. Because there are some kids, my niece was that way. She played and she was a back, and she would, all they wanted her to do was, if the ball gets to you, kick it as far as you possibly can in the other direction, so that they have to go get it and come back this way again. And again, in that's sometimes bad soccer, but there's a lot of bad soccer in the U.S.
I think what you said earlier about 3 max velocity sprints in a game, that's probably a pretty generous number. I don't think many soccer players are reaching that. Maybe like the wing midfielders or the forwards, but it's so rare, and it's so important to continue that sprint training. And are you doing the time sprints in season still for their in season programs?
Like my son and his friends time sprint year round, and they play pretty much they're still playing games now, but they play competitively, December through August, and we still sprint. The one thing we do, though, we're very, we try to educate our kids in terms of, if you're sore, you don't sprint.
Right.
And we want to make them understand, like, I'm never going to call you soft. I'm never going to say anything to you if you don't want to sprint. So with our kids, if they come in and they're like, they warm up and they think, oh, my hamstring's a little sore, my hip flex is a little sore, I'm like, everybody has the opportunity to opt out of time sprinting if they want to. I think if someone always opts out, then maybe I'm going to have a conversation with them and say, are you really that sore that you can never do this? Mm-hmm. But in general, and our kids are really good in terms of, they've gotten very smart. Like, I'll look over sometimes and there'll be 2 kids sitting on the stairs and I'm like, what are you doing? And they're like, I'm sore. We had lacrosse yesterday, we played 3 games and I don't think I want to sprint. So they're actually getting smarter and more intuitive as they get older, which is kind of what we wanted to have happen.
Mm-hmm. And it seems with some of the speed workouts, soreness shouldn't be a huge problem. And I'm actually doing your remote program for strength, and then with Tony Holler's atomic workout. And it's just so fascinating that I just haven't been sore at all. And I haven't sprinted since I played college soccer, Mike, since 10 years ago. And I tried Tony's workout and I'm like, yeah, I'm good. And it's just short and easy and just more quality focus.
Tony's is more volume than we would do, even still. Like I listened to his whole thing, but Tony and I think a lot alike in terms of, well, if you look at us, I would say it's sad. We look a lot alike. We're both literally the same age, 62-year-old bald guys with glasses.
How long have you been coaching? Because he's 41 years.
I'm 41 also.
Oh, okay. So you guys literally are twins.
Yeah, we are so parallel. It's crazy. And I only met him maybe 5 years ago, and it was crazy in terms of you look like me, you're the same age as me, you've been coaching the same time as me. But yeah, we were both, though, kids that went to college at 17 probably. And so we had graduated by the time we were 21. I had graduated and was working by the time I was 21, maybe 22. I forget exactly, but I probably had just turned 22 when I got my first job, and I'll be 63 in a month. So it's 41. This will be my 41st year.
That's crazy.
It is.
So much wisdom, and I just see you all over Twitter just sharing your thoughts on everything, and I love it, and I love that you're so involved still, and I really appreciated this conversation, and I definitely want you to plug your remote program because I'm working through it now because I just don't feel like writing my own and I need to outsource it, and I just am still looking to learn, but please plug your remote program because I'm really enjoying it for
Yes.
for
So
in season as well. It's really great.
if anybody's interested, it's on Train Heroic. The best way to get access to it, in all honesty, is to email us because this is sad to say. I'm not exactly sure how you access it on Train Heroic. I have two of our younger coaches that kind of basically run that part of our business. And so, but I tell people I answer my emails. I'm mboyle1959 at AOL.com. If somebody said, hey, I want to access Train Heroic, I can then connect you with Steve, or I can connect you with Ken, the guys who are in charge of the online portion of that, and we can get people up and running. And again, kids, adults, we have adult programs. We've actually done. The guys have done a really good job with the online stuff. We have to do a better job. We're not great at selling it, but we're not great at selling is clearly not our strong suit. But the good thing is results sell. So the fact we don't have trouble getting athletes, so that's good.
Guys, I highly recommend this program. And with our discussion on in season today, if you're crunched for time or there's a lot going on with school and practices and games, it's really good to be able to just do this on your own and just do it from home. And I strongly recommend doing a remote program. It's just super efficient. And I've loved the results so far. I'm getting back into playing adult soccer in the next few months. So I'm really excited and feeling
Yeah,
great.
and the one thing, especially because your audience is the young females. I mean, a young female can absolutely do this at home. You can buy a set of power block dumbbells. You can buy the 50-pound set, and you'll be good for a really long time. If you get to the point where your daughter is dumbbell benching the 50s and split squatting with the 50s and doing one leg straight leg deadlift with a 50-pound dumbbell, then they've done really well. So you'd get a lot of mileage out of getting, an online program like that, getting an adjustable bench and a set of 50-pound power blocks, and you're off to the races. You can do it at home. And the kids, then there's no excuse.
Agreed. So, guys, please check out that program. I'm going to link it in the caption below. I'm also going to link Mike's website as well as his Twitter. So, please give him a follow. Mike, thank you again. This was a really fun discussion.
Thanks for having me. Like I said, I love doing it. So I'm always up for a good conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you and see you guys next time.